All right. So, in our next set of spreads, or I should say, next in the set of our spreads on universal shadow work, today we're going to talk about privilege. And this is a controversial topic for some folks, although it really shouldn't be. So, I'm not showing myself today. I've got some slides to actually do some explanation around what we're talking about. It's important to know that any video I do on this is focused in particular on tarot and not so much on the socio-political concepts, but the resources are out there if you want them, and I have a couple recommendations for books that discuss these sorts of things, so feel free to reach out to me if you want to know more. I'm going to be very general in this description, but I think it's equally important. And again, in all of the videos I've done so far, what we're really thinking and talking about are the ways in which we contribute to what I've started calling the universal shadow. So this is shadow work where we're not focusing on the self, but rather our place within the larger community. And in doing so, we're looking at some harder aspects of ourselves, some things that maybe we don't think about or don't like to think about or have thought about but don't necessarily know how to engage with. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to talk about privilege today, and I want to start by really talking about what that means. There are different ways of thinking about privilege, and sometimes it's called unearned advantage. One of the struggles that anyone who wants to think or talk about these things has is that our language hasn't necessarily caught up to the concepts we're dealing with. People hear privilege and they view it as an insult. So when someone tells me, for example, you benefit from white privilege, you benefit from male privilege, the tendency is to get defensive. Hence the previous concept, the previous post I did about defensiveness. Only when we can start dealing with that defensive attitude can we start to explore the idea of our privilege, right? So there's a method to the madness. Another reason why people get confounded or confused about privilege is because we tend not to view ourselves as successful or privileged. We see ourselves as the sum total of our whole lives, not necessarily our successes. But privilege doesn't really have to do with success. Privilege has to do with the fact that while we have had it hard, various things in our lives have made that easier for us than for other folks. Or if you think about it this way, if you've had it hard, just imagine how difficult it's been for others who don't have access to the same institutional advantages that we all have. So this is a little exploration. There are many, 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 many kinds of privilege. And to some degree, everyone, more or less, has some unearned advantage or some privilege. That's not universal. There are folks who contextually would not on paper look like they have privilege. But we all, in some way or another, have some. Now, these are just a sampling of various kinds of privileges or advantages that impact our lives, that are institutional benefits that we reap without even realizing it. Some of them include being straight or white, affluent, coming from a relatively happy family, having relatively secure mental health, being native born in the place where we are, certainly being male, cis male, cis female, physically healthy, employment, college educated, easy access to childcare, physically fit, legacy students, Ivy League students, advanced degrees, being traditionally abled, English speaking. These are all examples of things. And you may look at this and your defensiveness may huckle up and say, well, I earned my access to Harvard. I earned my job. That's true. But with that comes advantages. And there's also privilege that provides us access to employment, that provides us access to Ivy League education, that provides us access to physical health or mental health. So even though some of these things are earned advantages, unearned advantage often allows us access to these things that we may not have otherwise had. So everyone in some way, shape, or form benefits from privilege. And just to give you an example, people tend to think of privilege as like a reverse hierarchy. And at the top, are straight, white, rich men, which in essence, that's kind of true. But even those folks have some disadvantages because they may not be physically fit, say, or they may not be mentally healthy. Everyone has. So it's not as simple as a hierarchy. It's not as simple as saying each privilege that we take away makes someone less likely to succeed or someone less privileged. That's not really how it works. Privilege or unearned advantage exists in combinations of experience, combinations of life circumstances. It's not a hierarchy per se, although it contributes to one. And so, you can have folks who come from different points of view and different experiences and sort of look at them, and we can look at ourselves in this way too. Now, these are very brief lists, and they don't really make up the whole sum of a person, and there are more advantages and disadvantages that you could add. But everything that's traditionally considered an advantage here is in bold. But you can see our straight, white, cis male, for example, also has disadvantages in that he is unemployed, lives below the poverty line, and has only a GED, which, to say only is problematic, right? Because that dismisses the work it takes to get one. But we have to remember that part of what makes something a disadvantage is the generalized perception of it. And so an employer or an advanced college may look at that and say, oh, it's only a GED, right? Everyone has privilege. Everyone has advantage, but everyone has disadvantage and or has things that prevent them from gaining access to the same advantages that others have. Now, it's easy to look at this chart and or whatever you want to call this list, and say, well, if everyone's advantage and disadvantage, is part of the makeup of who they are, then we're all complex and we all have it, and so why bother thinking about it? Well, it's not necessarily an even game, because not all advantages and disadvantages, not all unearned privileges are equal. There are things that tip the scales for and against folks. And it's important that we understand that, because if we want to truly engage in privilege and exploring our own privilege, we have to understand that not every privilege is created equal. So here on this scale, we have two cis male folks. Both are employed part-time. One has a GED, one has a high school diploma, but they are not equal in terms of privilege, in terms of advantage. And there's one reason why that you can't see on this chart yet, but that you will, and the example is their race. Now, here's where I start to lose people, right? Because we don't want to think about things in terms of race. We don't like to think that way. This should be even, right? Because they're more or less the same except for that, and I don't see color, and this person of color has the same opportunities that the white person does, so why is this white person's privilege greater than the person of color? Well, it has to do with the fact that the institutions and systems that we live within discriminate. And their reality is that even though we all have certain privileges and we all have certain advantages and we all have certain disadvantages, the institutions and systems with which we exist don't view everyone the same way. Not everyone has equal advantage. Not everyone has equal opportunity. And the reality is that some candidates are less likely to get hired than others, whether it's their race, their education level, or even their name. Some people are more likely to be sexually assaulted than others. That includes women and trans people. Some people are more likely to be attacked in a hate crime, which would include people of color, people in the LGBTQ+ community. Some people are more likely to be presumed guilty, particularly people of color. Some people are more likely to go to prison, particularly people who live below the poverty line or who are people of color. Some people are more likely to face poverty. Some people are less likely to receive degrees. Some people are more likely to end up homeless after costly medical issues. Some people are more likely to die from preventable medical issues. Some people are more likely to fall into addiction than others. All of these systems and institutions contribute to or take away from our bucket of advantages and disadvantages. And if we really want to understand how that works, it involves looking at ourselves and exploring again how these systems are unfair, how they contribute to disenfranchisement and marginalization of others, and how we benefit from those systems and institutions in the face of other people not having access to those things. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And that's what the spread that we're going to look at today is designed to explore. Now, this is hard to think about, it's hard to talk about, and there are really, 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 really complicated ways of diving into this. There's a lot to know about this, and there's a lot to explore, and I really recommend that folks do this. What I'm asking in this case is for everyone who wants to try this to accept in a sort of Buddhist kind of way that privilege is. It exists. And that those of us who are white, those of us who are employed, who are relatively affluent or middle class, those of us who have advanced degrees, etc., those things change people's perceptions about us in a way that makes it easier for us to get certain things. Privilege exists. And in order to explore that, we have to look at our place within it. All right. So that's how we're going to look at shadow work today. So in this spread, we're going to do a few things. It's very similar to the ones I've engaged before. Like all of them, it ends with, how can I check my progress? But the first one is, show me one way in which I benefit from unearned advantage or privilege. So in this first position, we're going to explore one way, and remember, like, these are not one-shot deals. We can do these over and over again. One way in which I benefit from unearned advantage. The second position is, show me one way that advantage contributes to the disenfranchisement or the marginalization of others. 3 asks to show me one way I can begin to face my own privilege. And again, we can't really do that until we explore the defensiveness in the previous section. 4 is interesting, and I've worded this very carefully. Show me one way I can use my place of privilege to enfranchise others without falling into saviorhood. And this is important because particularly for folks who are privileged, there's a tendency, even a latent arrogance, to assume that I can solve the problems of people who don't have the same privilege I do. And that is both bigoted and problematic. We can use our places of privilege to help, but we can't come in and pretend we're Superman and assume we have the problems to all the world's, the solutions to all the world's problems. We can engage without existing within saviorhood. And saviorhood also has the added problematic quality of expecting to be thanked, of expecting to be celebrated for it, of engaging in a celebration of our wokeness, which is something I've talked about in the previous 2 examples. That's not what this is about. This is individual action within the larger context to explore how we can reduce the universal shadow. Not about making ourselves feel good about how we've changed, how we've grown, or how woke we are. In fact, when white people use that term, I often bristle because people don't understand the cultural history of that word either. So how can I contribute to the community? How can I use my place of privilege to help enfranchise others without falling into saviorhood so that it becomes about me and what I'm offering and not about folks and what they're experiencing? And then finally we have, how can I check my progress? So that's our spread for this time. Like I've said, across the board, you can use 1 card for each position like any other spread, but I tend to use 3 cards, and I really find that that's valuable in terms of creating a fuller picture. So again, I'm going to do an example. It's not particularly about me, although you'll find that the answers probably apply to some part of you as much as they apply to me. This is an interesting spread to do because you can make it as specific as you want to be, but general answers in this case are not necessarily bad because of the systems and institutions that we work within. There are general rules of thumb that we're going to find probably commonalities. If we were to share what our results were, we'd probably find that other folks did very similar cards and very similar positions and similar answers. So again, this example is not particularly about me, but it's about me as much as it is about anyone who is similar to me. Another thing I'll say, and this is an activity I've had to do in various classes, is something you can do before you even sit down to do the spread is to just sit down and make a list of all the privileges and unearned advantages that you have in your life. And we all do. And it can be helpful just to take stock of things that have made us lucky in some way, as a precursor to doing this, and exploring the ways in which that has contributed to making our lives easier. Not easy, but easier. And I think that that's an important thing to consider too. But let's go through an example of the spread and how you might read it. So the first one is, show me a way in which I benefit from unearned advantage. And I find this is one of those times where tarot always makes me smile in a way, even though the context of this reading is serious. Because I just talked about systemic advantages and also institutional advantages. And with the Hierophant in that first position, the Hierophant is sort of the institution card in a way. The Hierophant represents traditions and institutions with which we're familiar. And so right out of the gate, we get a really strong sense that we benefit, or, I'll use this editorial I in this case, as though the reading were for me. And this is true of me, even though it wasn't particularly about me. The institutions are set up to benefit me. They actually do the labor. They take the burden of protecting me in that Nine of Wands so that I feel safe as the Knight of Cups and I feel secure. And certainly what's interesting with this deck is this Knight of Cups actually depicts someone homeless, that I don't feel like I have to go out and hunt for my security, that I feel secure. That I am the person inside the house in this card and not on the outside. That the institutions do the work, do the effort of preventing me from feeling out in the cold. The institutions serve me, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, I could dig deeper, but for the purposes of this example, I think that's a good place to start. This deck, I should say, is the Wheel of Change tarot, and it's pretty non-traditional in a lot of ways. And so as I go through with these examples, in some cases I'll be pulling from numerology, in some places I'll be pulling from Rider-Waite-Smith, some places right from the images on these cards. But the Hierophant certainly is that institution. Nines in this case, I'm looking at 9 as labor, as effort, as enthusiasm even. So the institutions enthusiastically do the labor of making me feel like I don't have to go out and hunt for my dinner, that I feel safe, and I have, with a Knight of Cups, kind of a romantic view of the world, that I'm not in a position to be standing on a street corner collecting change. The institutions work overtime for that to be true. So that's one way in which, and again, you'll notice that I say show me one way in all of these, because there are many ways. And again, this is something we can repeat and should repeat, because there are many ways in which we're impacted by these things. The second one is show me one way in which that advantage contributes to the disenfranchisement of others. And right out of the gate, the Five of Discs, even if you think about the more traditional Rider-Waite-Smith imagery, folks are out in the cold and they're struggling because the systems are not set up to support them. This Eight of Cups and Six of Swords here certainly has a cold and stormy quality to them. Folks are forced to move through the storm without the resources, without the institutions that are available to them, and they're basically forced to survive in a more difficult way. Because my life is easier, or rather the institutions are created to make my life easier, other people's lives are made more difficult. Because the resources aren't spared for others, they're not spread accurately, etc. Fives numerologically are very much about disruption, and so people's lives, their practical daily lives in terms of pentacles, are disrupted. And you just look at the cold, the storm, and both of those cards surrounding it. People are left out in the cold. They're left out in the storm, where institutions could be providing more benefits to them because I don't need them. 3 is show me one way I can begin to face my privilege. And I love that the Hierophant shows up here. And I love that the Hermit begins. And the Hermit, for me, is like you take that lamp and you shine your light on the situation. You really begin to look at yourself. And with the Ace of Cups, you begin to look with fresh eyes. When I was making my notes, I originally wrote innocent, but that has an implication I don't like. That I'm able to sort of begin from an emotionally blank place, explore and look at the institutions that I'm part of and the way in which they benefit me and don't benefit others. And to maybe realign myself with institutions that are more evenly beneficial, or that have the goal of making advantage more evenly available to everyone. So as the hermit, I go in and I look at the world. I shine my lamp on things. I look at the world with fresh eyes with the Ace of Cups, and I re-examine these institutions, and I realign myself with institutions that are more equitable. In number 4 here, we're the position 4, show me one way I can use my place of privilege to enfranchise others without falling into saviorhood. And again, that saviorhood thing is so important, because we can't act as though we're riding in on our, on our knight. We're not the knight in shining armor here to save people who need us. Like, there's something really presumptuous about assuming other people need our help. It's not really about that. What this is about is exploring how we can use a place of privilege to improve the world, to reduce the universal shadow. And justice is the first card here, and I think the sun and justice and the the 3 of wands rather in this particular deck is such a fun combo, which is like the sun for me is a spotlight, and so we shine our light, we draw attention to justice and injustice, and we sing about it. Those electric guitars, it's like we make the message known. We go out and we say, this is just, this is unjust, these are the things we need people to be aware of. And so we communicate what we've discovered to the world. We communicate what justice looks like to the world. We get on the stage and we sing about it. And I don't mean that literally, but we bring attention to, we shine a spotlight on things that need our attention. And that's one way we can engage. And again, this is just an example. And then finally, how can we check our progress? Well, with temperance, we see a rebalancing. Are we finding that things are rebalanced? Are we finding that the institutional labor with the 9 of Cups here is more dedicated to giving people what they need, if you think about the Rider-Waite-Smith vision of that? And that there's a rebalancing of the world with the 2 of Cups. All of this is really about balance. Are the institutions doing what they should be? Am I doing what I should be? And if the answer is yes, then I'm progressing. And if it's not, then no, I have more to go. I have further to go. So again, very, very quick samples of each of these. I do think that, like I said in the video about defensiveness, it's somewhat misleading when I do these, because what you're not seeing is the time and effort I spend on struggling with the cards and what they mean together. But it's just to give you an idea. But remember that this isn't easy, and it takes time and effort. And the evolution of these spreads that I've created, I wouldn't necessarily jump to this without doing the defensiveness one, especially if you feel like you bristle at the idea of privilege. I wouldn't necessarily do the defensiveness one without exploring and accepting the idea that unconscious bias is real, All of these build on each other, and I think it's an important thing. But as always, I would love to hear your experiences with working on these, and I would love to engage and see, how perceptions are changing, etc. So be well. I hope this is helpful, and hope to talk to you soon.